A thin silver harmonica lay on the edge of a pawnshop counter, trembling not because of the cold, but because the boy holding it had already decided to lose it before anyone could take it from him. And somewhere outside, unseen and unheard, a stranger was about to interrupt a moment that would never be repeated again. The city was moving like it always did. Cars coughing exhaust, neon signs flickering, footsteps echoing on wet pavement. But inside that small shop, time felt paused, suspended between what had already been lost and what was about to change forever. If you feel drawn to stories about quiet courage, impossible coincidences, and the strange way music finds broken people before they find it, then stay with this story. And if its tone already feels true to you, like it and subscribe, because moments like this deserve to be remembered before they disappear. I remember noticing the boy before anyone else did, mostly because he didn't look like someone trying to sell something. He looked like someone trying to convince himself that letting go was easier than holding on. His shoulders slightly hunched, his jacket too thin for the November air, his fingers pale and tense as they hovered over the harmonica, as if it might vanish if he touched it too firmly. The pawnshop itself was one of those places that smelled of old metal, dust, and quiet desperation. The kind of shop where clocks with missing hands shared shelves with cracked guitars and tarnished rings, where every object carried a story that no one bothered to ask about anymore. And behind the counter stood a man who had seen too many stories in the same way to feel surprised by another one. The boy's name, I would later learn, was Aaron Hale, 15 years old, still growing into his height, still wearing grief like something borrowed that didn't quite fit him yet. And he spoke softly when he finally pushed the harmonica forward, as if raising his voice might wake up a truth he wasn't ready to face, saying he wanted $150 for it, not because he believed it was worth that much, but because he needed it to be, because numbers sometimes felt safer than memories. The pawnshop owner turned the harmonica over in his hands with professional indifference, tapping it lightly against the counter, checking for scratches, age, brand markings, anything that might justify a higher price, while Aaron watched him with a mixture of hope and dread, the way someone watches a doctor read test results, knowing that whatever comes next will change something forever. The man finally sighed and said it was just a common instrument, nothing rare, nothing collectible, and offered $100 with the tired tone of someone who had made the same offer 1,000 times before. And for a moment Aaron didn't respond, because he was calculating more than money. He was measuring how much of his mother he could afford to lose. Outside, the wind rattled the glass door, and I saw a figure pause on the sidewalk, hesitate, then turn back as if pulled by something invisible, the bell above the door chiming softly when he stepped inside. And though nobody recognized him at first, there was something unmistakable in the way he carried himself, a quiet gravity that made the air around him feel slightly heavier. He didn't rush, didn't speak immediately, just stood near the entrance, as if listening not to the voices in the shop, but to something deeper, something underneath them. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, low, and strangely familiar, asking if the boy could play the harmonica before selling it, not demanding, not dramatic, just curious in a way that felt sincere rather than intrusive. Aaron turned slowly, confusion flickering across his face, and I saw the moment recognition hit him. Not the kind that comes from seeing a celebrity, but the kind that comes from realizing that someone is actually paying attention. And for a second he looked as if he might refuse, as if playing the harmonica would make the decision harder, but then he lifted it to his lips, hesitated, and played. The first notes were uncertain, almost fragile, but then something shifted, and the sound that came out wasn't polished or perfect. It was raw and uneven and painfully honest, like a voice trying to speak after years of silence. And as the melody unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't a song learned from a book or copied from a record. It was something shaped by absence, by late nights, by conversations that would never happen again. The pawnshop owner stopped counting bills, a woman near the door forgot to leave, and the stranger by the entrance closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only he could hear. And when Aaron finally lowered the harmonica, the silence that followed felt heavier than the music itself. The stranger stepped forward, and only then did I recognize him fully. Bob Dylan, older now, quieter than the images people carried of him, but unmistakably himself, standing in a pawnshop like he had every right to be there. And he looked at Aaron not with pity, not with awe, but with a kind of recognition that felt almost unsettling, asking him where he learned to play like that. And Aaron answered simply that his mother taught him, that she used to play at night when the house felt too quiet, that she said music was something you held on to when words stopped working. Dylan nodded slowly, as if that explanation answered more questions than Aaron realized. And then he asked the question that mattered most, not about money or value, but about intention, asking whether Aaron really wanted to sell the harmonica or whether he felt like he had no other choice. And the boy didn't answer immediately, because the truth was harder to say than any lie. Instead, he stared at the counter, at the faint scratches on the metal, at the place where his mother's fingers had rested countless times. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, saying he needed the money, that rent was due, that things were complicated, and Dylan didn't argue, didn't lecture, didn't romanticize the situation. He just reached into his coat, pulled out a wallet, and placed several folded bills on the counter with deliberate calm, offering far more than the pawnshop owner ever would, but making it clear with a quiet shake of his head that he wasn't buying the harmonica. "I'm not paying for the instrument," he said, looking directly at Aaron. "I'm paying for the moment before you decide to lose it." And something in the way he said it made the words feel less like advice and more like a warning from someone who had already made the wrong choice once and spent a lifetime understanding it. Aaron stared at the money as if it might disappear if he blinked, his fingers tightening around the harmonica, his mind racing between practicality and memory, survival and loyalty. And in that instant I realized that this wasn't just a story about a boy and a famous musician, but about the fragile line between what we keep and what we give up, between the objects we sell and the pieces of ourselves that go with them. And as Dylan gently gestured toward the door, inviting Aaron outside for a conversation that felt less like an opportunity and more like a turning point, I knew that whatever happened next would not just change the boy's life, but would leave a mark on everyone who happened to witness it. Because some moments arrive quietly, without drama or spectacle, and yet they carry enough weight to alter the course of a future that hasn't even begun to understand itself yet. The street outside the pawnshop felt colder than it had minutes earlier, as if the wind had sharpened its edge the moment Aaron stepped out with the harmonica clenched in his fist and Bob Dylan standing a few feet away, quiet and unreadable, watching him not like a celebrity watching a fan, but like someone recognizing a reflection of his own past. Cars rushed by, horns echoed, people passed without noticing that anything unusual was happening. Yet for Aaron the world had narrowed to the space between his hands and Dylan's voice, which broke the silence with unexpected gentleness, asking him why he was really selling the harmonica. And the question hit harder than any accusation because it forced him to say what he had tried not to think, that the money mattered, that rent was due, that the fridge was almost empty, that survival had started to feel heavier than memory. Dylan listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, and when Aaron finished, he didn't argue about logic or responsibility. He simply said that some things you sell once and spend the rest of your life trying to find again, and the words lingered in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Aaron looked down at the harmonica, remembering his mother sitting by the kitchen window after long shifts, playing soft melodies while telling him that music was the only thing that didn't lie. And suddenly the thought of handing it over to a stranger felt less like a transaction and more like a betrayal, not just of her, but of himself. Dylan asked him if he had ever played for anyone else, and Aaron shook his head, admitting that he only played alone because he was afraid people would hear too much, would hear the sadness he couldn't hide. And Dylan replied quietly that being heard was the risk every real musician had to take, because silence might feel safe, but it never leads anywhere. Then Dylan did something that made Aaron's breath catch. He told him about a small show happening the next night. Not a big stage, not cameras or crowds, just a room full of people who still listened, and said that if Aaron wanted, he could play one song before him. The offer felt unreal, almost cruel in its audacity, and fear rushed through Aaron's chest as he imagined standing alone under lights, exposed and trembling. Yet beneath that fear was something brighter and more dangerous. The possibility that his mother's music wasn't finished, that it might live on through him instead of disappearing in a pawnshop drawer. Dylan handed him a scrap of paper with an address and time, his handwriting rough and hurried, and told him he didn't have to decide right away, That courage wasn't something you borrowed from others, but something you discovered in yourself when the moment arrived. As Dylan walked away into the crowd, his figure dissolving into the noise of the city, Aaron stood still on the sidewalk, torn between the certainty of selling the harmonica and the terrifying chance of keeping it. And for the first time since his mother's death, he felt something that wasn't grief or exhaustion, but a fragile spark of possibility, because he finally understood that the real choice wasn't about money at all, but about whether he was ready to let her voice disappear forever or brave enough to let it speak through him. The next evening arrived quietly, without ceremony, as if the city had no idea that something irreversible was about to happen inside a small, dimly lit venue tucked between a laundromat and a closed bookstore, and Aaron stood in the narrow hallway backstage with the harmonica resting in his palm, feeling its familiar weight while his heart raced in a way it never had before. The room beyond the curtain was small, filled with low murmurs, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of anticipation, not the kind of crowd that screamed or demanded, but the kind that listened, and somehow that made it more terrifying. Dylan sat on a wooden chair nearby, tuning his guitar with casual calm, not watching Aaron directly, but somehow aware of every movement he made. And when their eyes finally met, Dylan didn't smile or offer encouragement. He simply nodded once, as if to say that whatever happened next belonged entirely to the boy. When Aaron stepped onto the stage, the lights felt warmer than he expected, the silence deeper, and for a moment he considered walking back off, disappearing into the night where nobody expected anything from him. But then he remembered the pawnshop counter, the pawnshop owner's indifferent voice, his mother's tired smile, and the way the harmonica had sounded when he played it not to survive, but to speak, and he lifted it to his lips. The first note came out shaky, but it didn't stop there. It grew, unfolded, found its shape, and as the melody filled the room, Aaron felt something he had never felt before. Not grief, not fear, not desperation, but connection, as if the sound was building a bridge between who he had been and who he might become. And when the final note faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive, charged with recognition, until applause slowly rose from the crowd. Not loud, not wild, but honest. Backstage, Dylan stood and placed a hand on Aaron's shoulder, his voice quiet but firm when he said that some instruments aren't meant to be sold, because they carry more than metal and wood. They carry voices that refuse to die. And Aaron understood then that the harmonica had never been just his mother's. It had always been his future waiting for him to claim it. He never sold it. Not for rent money, not for comfort, not for certainty. And years later, when people asked him where his music began, he never spoke first about stages or audiences or chance meetings with legends. He spoke about a cold pawnshop, a trembling hand, and the moment he realized that holding on was sometimes the bravest thing a person could do, because some sounds are not meant to be traded, and some losses are not meant to be erased. They are meant to be transformed into something that lasts.